The fluorescent lights hum their endless mechanical prayer over Sacred Heart's ICU, a sound Margaret Walsh stopped noticing somewhere around year 2. She moves through the ward with the kind of efficiency that makes itself invisible, pushing a stainless steel cart laden with bedpans, bleach solution, and the particular indignity that comes with 3 years of wiping down after people who used to have better jobs than this. The antiseptic smell hangs thick as fog, cutting through the stale coffee residue on her scrubs where she'd spilled half a cup during morning rounds. No one in the break room had moved to help her. No one had offered napkins. They'd simply waited for her to leave before resuming their conversation. Margaret is 53 years old and has the kind of hands that belong in a different life, hands with surgical precision built into their muscle memory, hands that move when her eyes assess a monitor the way other people read weather reports. She doesn't think about this anymore. Thinking about it serves no purpose. Instead, she focuses on the ventilator settings in room 407, where a septic patient from the ER is finally stabilizing, oxygen saturation climbing from 84% toward a more sustainable rhythm. She adjusts the PEEP valve by 2 centimeters of water pressure, a minor intervention, almost subconscious, and a travel nurse from Portland working the rotating contract actually stops mid-stride to watch. "Your hands," the travel nurse says, her name tag reading Susan. "They move like a surgeon." Margaret doesn't look up from the monitor. She wipes the ventilator screen with a corner of her scrub and offers the kind of smile that closes conversations. "Just practice," she says quietly. Years of practice. The shift continues in the rhythm Margaret has learned to inhabit, medication verification at the 0800 mark, for line changes on the 3 post-op patients in the East Wing, the feeding tube reassessment for Mr. Chen in 412 who'd been aspirating. When she reconnects his tube, a 14 French Dobhoff positioned against the pylorus, the kind of precision work that requires both knowledge and hands steady as surgical steel, she moves through the steps with an economy of motion that makes it look like ballet. Like something choreographed by someone who had practiced this exact sequence in a forward surgical team tent in Helm and Provence while mortar rounds shook the pole supports and her fingers had to stay absolutely steady because someone's life depended on her not flinching. But she does flinch now. Not visibly. Not on the outside. But inside, in the space where memory lives, her hands remember different work. Hands that had held a femoral artery together with nothing but pressure and time. Hands that had secured central lines while the ground shook. Hands that had written reports she was ordered to burn. Before her shift started, before the break room rejection, before the fluorescent lights claimed her attention, Margaret had touched the jacket hanging in her locker. Her fingers found the interior lining as they always did, the place where a faded unit patch had been sewn by hand using stitches no one would ever see. 42nd Naval Construction Battalion. The letters had faded to nearly nothing, the gold threading turned the color of old brass. She'd touched it for exactly 3 seconds, the way she touched it every morning, a ritual that connected her to a person she'd been ordered to forget. Then she'd buttoned the jacket, hung it back up, and became Margaret Walsh again, just a nurse, just an LPN, just the woman pushing bedpans at Sacred Heart in Norfolk. The admission alert sounds at 1045 hours. Not the usual ICU chime. The trauma chime. The one that brings heads up from computers and sends nurses into coordinated motion like a school of fish receiving a signal. The speaker crackles, incoming trauma. Marine. IED blast. Germany to Norfolk direct. ETA 15 minutes. ICU standby, full team. The room's energy shifts. Suddenly every monitor matters. Suddenly every bed status gets reassessed. Room 408 is cleared of a recovering dialysis patient. The isolation protocols come down. Crash cart position gets moved to optimal sight line. Margaret does all of this without being asked, knowing her place, knowing that someone like her doesn't take the lead. She adjusts flow rates, verifies crash cart supplies, confirms the defibrillator pads aren't expired. A 14-month-old box of syringes gets replaced with fresh stock. The portable ultrasound machine gets wheeled to the ready position. Everything is preparation for someone else's expertise. The elevator doors open and the stretcher emerges like something from a television program about hope and loss. The patient is a boy, maybe 16, maybe 17, with one side of his face reconstructed by surgery that's still recent enough to show bruising. His eyes are open but not present. The attending from trauma speaks in clipped, efficient sentences. Michael Hartley, 17 years old, IED blast in Marjah 3 weeks ago, multiple surgeries at Landstuhl Regional, transferred for neuroassessment and potential rehabilitation. The words carry the weight of a closed prognosis already written. Moderate to severe traumatic brain injury, currently non-responsive except to deep stimuli, minimal spontaneous movement in right extremities. Then the man in the doorway speaks. Dr. Richard Sterling fills the threshold like he's personally rearranged the architecture to fit him better. He's in his early 60s, with the kind of grooming that costs money, hair perfectly maintained, suit that probably cost 3 months of Margaret's salary, shoes polished to a military gleam. The way he moves into the ICU suggests he's taking possession of something. The trauma team parts for him automatically. The attending drops into a subordinate posture Margaret recognizes instantly. This is the man who's been called because this is the man who gets called. According to the unit gossip, Dr. Sterling trained at Johns Hopkins, published 47 papers, served on 3 hospital boards, and had brought 2 malpractice settlements to quiet conclusions with the kind of settlements that require institutional silence. He's a man who has never been wrong in public. Get me the best minds in neurology, Sterling says to no one in particular, which means he's talking to everyone. I want 12 specialists. Neurosurgery, neurotrauma, cognitive rehabilitation, behavioral medicine, the full spectrum. This patient's father is a Marine general. We're assembling a team that makes that fact irrelevant. I want their assessments in 48 hours. This boy's going to walk again, or we'll understand exactly why he won't. The statement hangs in the ICU like a declaration. Margaret is connecting Michael Hartley's ventilator tubing when Sterling sweeps past her without seeing her, the way people don't see the furniture they move through. She's already invisible to him. Already beneath the architecture of his attention. She finishes the connection with the kind of surgical precision that makes the coupling lock with the quiet hiss of air escaping, a small, mechanical sound that only someone listening for it would register. Her hands are perfectly steady. The first day becomes a rhythm of assessments. Sterling moves through with his entourage, residents, fellows, the attending who defer to him in every interaction. Margaret works around them, adjusting medication drips, monitoring cerebral pressure readings on the ICP monitor, documenting the Glasgow Coma Scale measurements that never improve. Michael Hartley remains where he is, unconscious, minimally responsive, his brain apparently fractured in ways that surgery couldn't repair. The unit becomes hushed around him, the way it does when everyone's quietly calculating whether hope is still medically appropriate. On the second afternoon, a rotation comes through, an army medic working a civilian clinical rotation, someone with the bearing of someone who'd actually been places and done things. His name tag reads Cooper and his eyes move through the ICU with the kind of assessment Margaret recognizes, not looking for pathology, but looking for competence. When Margaret finishes reconnecting Michael's feeding tube, 14 French Dobhoff, proper placement confirmation, the sutures holding the catheter in place tied with the kind of knots that won't slip under continuous pressure, Cooper actually stops moving. "Where did you learn to tie sutures like that?" he asks. Margaret doesn't turn from the monitor. She's logging the feeding tube placement confirmation into the chart, her handwriting steady and precise. She allows herself 2 seconds before responding. "Field medicine courses," she says quietly. "Years ago." "That's not a field medicine technique," Cooper says. He's still watching her hands. "That's a surgical knot. That's what you use when you need something to hold under pressure and you don't get a second chance." The fluorescent lights hum their endless song. Monitors beep their regular rhythms. Somewhere in the hospital, an alarm sounds and fades. Margaret finishes the documentation and turns to face Cooper directly for the first time. Her eyes are the color of winter weather, and there's something in them, just a flicker, just for a moment, that makes a combat medic stop asking questions. "I've done a lot of different work," Margaret says. She buttons the jacket with the hidden unit patch still resting in the break room locker. In a lot of different places. Sometimes you pick things up and never forget them. Cooper nods slowly, and whatever he's calculating behind his eyes, he decides not to pursue. But the moment lingers, the recognition passing between two people who've both seen enough to know that a nurse pushing bedpans probably isn't the only thing she's ever been. Margaret returns to her rounds. The shift continues. Michael Hartley remains motionless in his bed, and Dr. Sterling begins making phone calls to assemble 12 specialists who will need exactly 48 hours to confirm what they already suspect, that this boy's brain is too damaged for redemption. Margaret touches the unit patch through her jacket lining as she walks toward the break room for her mandated 15-minute break. She does it once, 3 seconds, the way she touches it every shift. A ritual that belongs to someone else. Someone that no one at Sacred Heart will ever need to know about. Dr. Sterling walked into the ICU at 0800 hours with 12 specialists trailing behind him like a school of sharks. Neurologists, physiatrists, trauma surgeons, each one carrying a file, each one carrying the weight of certainty. They moved past Margaret's station without acknowledgement, their shoes clicking against the tile in synchronized precision. She'd heard the general arrive at dawn. She'd watched his wife carry a rosary in one hand and a cold coffee in the other, both trembling. The rounds took place at Corporal Michael Hartley's bedside. Margaret stood at the nurse's station reviewing the chart, keeping her distance, knowing that was what was expected. Through the glass walls of the ICU bay, she watched Sterling present the case with the tone of someone delivering a verdict. The general and his wife stood in the corner like defendants awaiting sentencing. Sterling spoke in measured clinical language, but every word landed like a hammer. Severe traumatic brain injury. Diffuse axonal injury. Likely permanent cognitive impairment. No meaningful recovery expected for motor function. No meaningful recovery expected for speech. The specialists nodded. Sterling synthesized their conclusions with the authority of someone who had never been wrong. The boy would remain in a wheelchair. The boy would never speak again. That was the consensus of 12 minds, and 12 minds were harder to argue with than one. Margaret should have stayed at her station. Should have entered the vitals into the system. Should have done what she was hired to do, what she was allowed to do. But the chart told a different story than the doctors had written. The blast mechanism notation caught her eye: proximity explosion, 47 meters from detonation point, combination of percussion wave and fragmentation impact, head and torso primary exposure. That wasn't just traumatic brain injury. That was a specific injury pattern. That was tamponade combined with concussive force, the exact same mechanism she'd seen recover differently, recover *beta*, when treated with modified vestibular stimulation protocols combined with aggressive early mobilization. She'd watched it happen in field hospitals in Marjah. She'd watched quadriplegic Marines walk. She'd watched non-verbal patients speak again. Sterling emerged from the room at 0915 hours. Margaret approached him quietly in the hallway, away from the general's sight line, the way she approached everything at Sacred Heart, small, deferential, apologetic for existing. "Doctor, I noticed something in the blast mechanism. The proximity pattern suggests." "Ms. Walsh." His voice cut like a scalpel. "You've read the chart." "I was documenting his overnight labs, Anne. Come with me." He didn't wait for her response. He turned and walked directly into Michael's room, and Margaret followed because you didn't say no to Dr. Sterling. The general was still there. His wife was still there. For staff members were noting vitals on the whiteboard. Sterling positioned himself between Margaret and the patient's family, a move so deliberate it could only be theatrical. "General Hartley, I apologize. Sometimes our bedpan nurses develop delusions of competence." Sterling's voice carried the smooth weight of condescension, the kind that sounded like concern to people who didn't understand it was a weapon. "Ms. Walsh, you're an LPN, correct? Not a neurologist." "No, but I've observed." "You've observed?" He smiled at the general. The smile of someone sharing a private joke. This is exactly why scope of practice exists, Ms. Walsh. To prevent exactly this. Stick to vitals. Stick to bedpans. Leave neurology to neurologists. He walked to the public unit board in the hallway without another word. Margaret stood paralyzed in the room for a moment, the general's eyes meeting hers with something like pity, before she followed Sterling outside. She watched him uncap a red dry erase marker. She watched him write in letters large enough for the entire unit to read, M. Walsh, written warning, overstepping licensure. He capped the marker with deliberate slowness. Don't make me do that again, Ms. Walsh. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and fluorescent desperation. Margaret sat at her usual table the next day with her lunch, a sad sandwich and applesauce in a container, and 3 nurses at her table collected their trays without a word and moved to another table. They didn't exchange glances. They didn't make it seem casual. One of them had been friendly enough to ask about her weekend 2 days prior. Now they moved like she'd become infectious. A young orderly named Carlos, rushing between tasks the way orderlies always did, bumped her elbow as he passed. Her coffee, barely half full, because she'd been thinking about the general's sun seizure threshold, not about holding cups steady, splashed across her scrubs in a brown arc. The cup toppled onto its side. Liquid dripped onto the tile floor like an accusation. Dr. Sterling was passing the break room doorway. He slowed. He looked at her soaked uniform. He looked at the spilled coffee spreading across the table. And in the flat, public, undeniable way of someone performing power, he said loudly enough that the entire break room heard every word, "Can't even hold a cup steady, Walsh. Maybe it's time to retire. We need nurses with steadier hands." The break room went quiet. Not the quiet of tension. The quiet of performance. Everyone was watching Sterling, waiting to see what he would do next, and watching Margaret to see if she would break. Margaret took one measured breath. She felt the air fill her lungs the way it had in Marjah when a mortar round hit close enough to feel the percussion. The way it had every time she decided to survive something. A single tear escaped her left eye, not because she was crying, but because her body was responding to the adrenaline spike like the finely tuned instrument it was. She wiped it without breaking her gaze from Sterling's face. Her hand was steady. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of 12 years of decisions that mattered. "I've held steady through worse than you can imagine, Doctor." She stood. She gathered the napkins Carlos had thrust toward her. She dabbed at her scrubs with movements precise enough that they looked like she was performing surgery on fabric. She placed her empty lunch container in the trash with the kind of care a person gives to things they're never going to see again. Then she walked out of the break room and back to her rounds. Sterling didn't follow her. He didn't need to. He'd made his point, and everyone in that break room had witnessed it. Isolation was a strategy that required no words. It required only absence, the absence of colleagues at lunch, the absence of help when you needed it, the absence of the professional courtesy that made a hospital function like anything other than a kingdom of predators. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 3 nights later, when Margaret was working the 1900 to a 0700 shift and the general's sun began to seize at 0300 hours like his body was finally going to say what his doctors had already said, that there was nothing left to recover. Michael's monitors screamed. Heart rate spiked from 88 to 147 in the space of 2 heartbeats. His body convulsed against the bed rails. Margaret was at his bedside in seconds, 8 paces from the nurse's station, muscle memory burning her toward the crisis before her conscious mind had even registered the numbers. The seizure lasted 43 seconds. Then it stopped. Then something worse happened. His blood pressure dropped. 78/42. Then 70/38. His oxygen saturation plummeted, 88, 82, 76, and Margaret recognized the pattern with a kind of crystalline certainty that only comes when you've seen a thing die before. Cardiac tamponade. Delayed complication from the blast. Fluid around the heart, compressing it, strangling it. Michael had maybe 2 minutes before the pressure difference would stop his heart entirely. Code team was 4 minutes away. The attending physician was in the parking garage, 6 minutes minimum. Margaret's hands moved before her mind finished thinking. She didn't deliberate. She didn't call for permission. She simply moved with the muscle memory of someone who had done this exact thing when the only option was success or watching someone die. Ultrasound. Now. She said it like an order, not a request, to Vasquez, the rotating army medic who happened to be working the night shift. He moved without question. Margaret prepped Michael's left anterior chest wall with chlorhexidine, her movements economical and precise. The ultrasound transducer found the pericardial space like it was looking for home. There. The effusion. Blood-tinged fluid compressing the ventricles. She marked the spot. 22nd intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Hand me the spinal needle. Vasquez placed it in her palm. An 18-gauge needle on a 10 cubic centimeter syringe, the kind of thing that looked simple until you had to use it to stop someone from dying without killing them in the process. Margaret's breathing slowed. She became something other than a person. She became the procedure. The needle advanced through skin, through muscle, through pleura, until it breached the pericardial sac. The hiss of air escaping as pressure normalized. The draw of the plunger. 200 milliliters of blood-tinged fluid in the syringe. 60 milliliters. 100 milliliters. 160 milliliters. Michael's blood pressure climbed. 74/40. 82/45. 89/52. His oxygen saturation rose. 78, 84. 91, sinus rhythm returned. His body relaxed against the mattress like something invisible had finally released him. By the time the code team arrived, 3 minutes and 20 seconds later, Margaret was documenting the event in the chart with the kind of clinical precision that made it sound like nothing had happened at all. Fluid aspiration. Vitals stabilized. Patient responsive. By the time the attending physician burst into the room with red in his face, Michael was breathing normally and his heart was beating like a heart that wanted to stay. "You did a pericardiocentesis?" The attending looked at the chart. Looked at Margaret. Looked at the empty syringe on the tray. "You're an LPN." Margaret didn't respond. She simply continued documenting. Some things didn't require explanation. Some things were what they were. But Vasquez was staring at her with new eyes. An hour later, when the shift had stabilized and the chaos had reduced itself to the manageable hum of a working ICU, he found her in the supply room restocking equipment she'd used. "Where did you learn to tie sutures like that?" His voice had changed. It carried recognition the way a radio carries frequency. "I watched you secure that line. That's not LPN training. That's combat medicine. That's field hospital technique." Margaret placed another box of 4x4 gauze on the shelf. She moved with the deliberate slowness of someone who had learned that silence was sometimes the most important skill. "I read a lot," she said. She didn't look at him. She moved past him toward the door with the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst thing she could imagine. That wasn't reading. Vasquez called after her, but she was already gone. She was back at the nurse's station. She was back where she belonged, invisible, competent, and carrying a secret that was 6 feet tall and wearing a Marine uniform somewhere in a wheelchair, waiting for the world to tell him he'd never walk again. She touched the faded unit patch through her jacket lining that night before she left. The one sewn inside by hands that belonged to someone else, someone who had made a decision years ago to disappear. True class is what you do when the lights go out. The lights in intensive care never truly went dark. Margaret knew this by 02:47 hours on the third night after Sterling had dressed her down in front of the general. The fluorescent panels above burned with a constancy that mimicked daylight, fooling nobody's circadian rhythms, stealing sleep from nurses who would clock out at dawn looking hollowed out and 30 years older than they'd been at shift change. She moved through the unit with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that invisibility was a kind of armor. The monitors beeped their rhythmic affirmations: oxygen saturation, heart rate, intracranial pressure, a mechanical chorus that Margaret had trained herself to filter into background white noise, listening instead for the change in tone that meant a patient was crashing. She had taught herself this skill in a tent hospital outside Marjah, where 3 nurses covered 47 wounded Marines, and the difference between hearing a subtle shift and missing it was the difference between a soldier going home or not going home at all. Corporal Michael Hartley lay in Bay 4, the same bay where he had arrived 9 days earlier, with his eyes fixed and dilated, the blast from the IED having rewritten the neural pathways that connected intention to movement. The general sat vigil in a recliner beside his son's bed, asleep with his jaw clenched tight, medals on his uniform catching the harsh overhead light, a bronze star at his left pocket, a silver star at the right. Margaret had memorized the pattern of his breathing by the second night. The general would sleep for exactly 43 minutes, then wake and check his son's vitals on the monitor as if the machines had somehow lied in the interim, then settle back down for another cycle. A father's arithmetic. Desperation masquerading as routine. At 0300 hours precisely, Michael's monitor changed its song. The seizure started as a flutter in the waveform. Margaret caught it before any alarm fired, the way a musician hears a single wrong note in an orchestra. She was at his bedside in footsteps, muscle memory overriding conscious thought, her hands already checking his airway as his body went rigid, his back arching off the mattress with the blind violence of misfiring neurons. The general jolted awake, reaching for his son, and Margaret placed a steady hand on his arm, not restraining, just presence. The seizure lasted 18 seconds. Not long. Long enough. When his muscles finally released, Michael's breathing came shallow and wrong, the pattern fragmented, the color draining from his face like water from a broken vessel. The monitors screamed. Blood pressure 72/40. Oxygen saturation plummeting. Heart rate climbing toward 160 with a quality to the waveform that made Margaret's stomach drop because she recognized what she was seeing: muffled heart sounds, jugular venous distension, the classic triad that meant the pericardial sac surrounding his heart was filling with fluid, pressing down on the myocardium, squeezing his ability to pump. Cardiac tamponade. Not a likely complication. Not something the 12 specialists Sterling had assembled would have predicted. But Margaret had seen this exact presentation twice before in field hospitals where trauma patients developed post-traumatic effusion days after their initial injury, and she knew the mathematics of it the way she knew how to tie her boots. This boy had maybe 4 minutes before his heart stopped beating altogether. She reached for the intercom, her voice steady as a ballast: "Code Blue, ICU Bay 4. Attending to the floor. Now." The general was on his feet. What's happening? What's wrong with him? Margaret was already moving, already opening the crash cart, already pulling out the ultrasound probe because the attending, Dr. Reeves, a competent pulmonologist who had signed off on Michael's care 2 hours ago, was somewhere in the parking garage driving home on a routine shift, still maybe 30 seconds away from reaching his car, still unaware that everything he thought was stable had just shifted into catastrophe. The ultrasound took 3 seconds to initialize. The image bloomed on the screen in shades of gray and black, and there it was, unmistakable, the pericardial sac distended like a balloon, echogenic fluid pressing down on the right ventricle, the heart itself squeezing in narrowing arcs, the organ struggling against the weight of fluid that was slowly, methodically suffocating it from the outside in. "General, step back. Now. Do not argue." The authority in her voice was something new. Something that didn't belong to the invisible LPN who apologized for taking breaks. It was older than that, deeper than that, a voice that had commanded medics under fire and been obeyed without hesitation. The general heard it and moved. Margaret's hands were already opening the sterile field. The pericardiocentesis needle was 18 gauge, long and thin and wickedly sharp, the kind of needle that looked delicate until you understood what it could do. She located the 5th intercostal space, marked it with her finger, prepped the skin with chlorhexidine in 3 quick swipes. No time for full sterile procedure. No time for ceremony. No time for anything except the ultrasound probe in her left hand guiding the needle trajectory while her right hand found the exact angle, the exact depth, the muscle memory of her hands moving independent of her thinking brain because her brain was too busy calculating fluid volume and perfusion pressure and the exact number of seconds before cardiac output bottomed out completely. The needle slipped between the ribs like it was meant to go there. She advanced it millimeter by millimeter, watching the ultrasound screen, seeing the needle tip approach the pericardial sac, and then, the subtle give as the needle penetrated the fibrous layer. She felt it more than saw it, the sensation traveling through the needle hub into her fingertips, a feedback mechanism that modern medicine had mostly abandoned but that her hands had learned to read in conditions where ultrasound didn't exist and your only guide was proprioception and experience. "Flush," she said, and a nurse, one of the newer ones who was smart enough not to question a command delivered with that particular cadence, handed her a syringe of normal saline. The pressure released. The syringe filled with dark, serosanguinous fluid, the accumulation of 9 days of bleeding into the pericardial space, each milliliter a tiny incremental pressure increase until the system crossed the threshold into hemodynamic collapse. Margaret withdrew exactly 80 milliliters, watching the monitors as she worked. The waveform was already improving. The muffled heart sounds were becoming clearer. The blood pressure started climbing, 74. 80. 86. Sinus rhythm. Steady. Alive. Dr. Reeves burst through the door 47 seconds after the code had been called, his hair still wet from the parking lot rain, his face cycling through the calculations of a physician who had been absent from his own patient's crisis. He saw Margaret with her hand on the needle, the fluid-filled syringe, the ultrasound still running, the monitors now displaying the vital signs of a child who was still alive because the woman standing in front of him had done something that wasn't her job, that wasn't her scope of practice, that had violated approximately 14 different hospital policies and 3 state nursing board regulations. "Step away from the patient," he said, and his voice was careful, because he could see exactly what had just happened and he was intelligent enough to understand that Margaret Walsh had just saved this boy's life by doing something that would likely end her career. She stepped back. She always stepped back. She had spent 3 years stepping back, anticipating physicians' needs, apologizing for her own competence, making herself smaller and quieter and less threatening. The general was staring at his son's monitors. The child was breathing. The child was alive. The general looked at Margaret and then at the needle in her hand and then at Dr. Reeves, and something shifted behind his eyes, not gratitude, not yet, but the first dawning recognition that he was standing in a room where a miracle had just occurred and that he needed to understand which direction it had come from. The storm came later. By 0600 hours, when the night shift was still an hour from ending, Sterling had the incident report in his hands. He sat at his desk in a private office with a view of the parking lot and the Elizabeth River beyond, reading the narrative 3 times, his jaw tightening another degree with each pass. An LPN had performed an emergency pericardiocentesis without physician supervision. An LPN had made a clinical judgment call about the need for an invasive procedure. An LPN had succeeded where protocol said she should have failed. The boy was stable. The general's son was alive and responsive and asking for water, which meant his cerebral perfusion had improved enough to wake the parts of his brain that understood thirst. Sterling's mind moved like a calculator working through a complex problem. He couldn't attack her directly, not after she had just saved a general's child. The optics were impossible. The publicity nightmare too large. A physician who fired the nurse who saved his patient's life would be portrayed as vindictive, petty, threatened. He needed something else. He needed leverage. He needed to reframe the narrative from "she saved a life" to "she represents a danger to the institution," and he needed to do it quietly, through channels, with documentation that made her termination look like a necessary administrative action rather than retaliation. He picked up his office phone. His first call went to Johns Hopkins, to a colleague named Mitchell who had been his roommate in medical school 24 years ago. "I need a favor," Sterling said, and explained the situation in terms that made Margaret's action sound like reckless grandstanding. His second call went to the State Nursing Board investigator's direct line, a man named Caldwell who had worked 3 previous cases with Sterling and understood his way of thinking. "Credential fraud. Verify her background. I believe she may be operating on a false license." His third call was to the hospital administrator, delivered in a tone of grave concern. "I'm not making accusations. I'm raising red flags. We may have a significant liability exposure here." By mid-morning, the machinery of institutional power had begun its work. Dr. Sterling sat in the administrative conference room on the 4th floor, phone pressed to his ear, voice smooth as surgical steel. "Yes, I understand. Thank you for taking my call on short notice." The 3 board members across from him, men he'd gone to medical school with at Duke, men with corner offices and country club memberships, leaned forward. "This is a matter of immediate credentialing concern. A patient nearly died last night due to protocol violations by unlicensed personnel." Sterling tapped his pen against the mahogany table. "We need an emergency review. Today, if possible." The first board member, Dr. Hayes, nodded slowly. "You're certain about this, Robert? Seems like a serious allegation." "Absolutely certain." The woman performed an advanced cardiac procedure without supervision. Spinal needle. Ultrasound guidance. She could have killed him. Sterling's jaw tightened with manufactured concern. "We're looking at potential fraud. False credentials. Maybe she never even completed her LPN requirements." The second call took 18 minutes. Sterling dialed Margaret's references, the 3 nurses she'd listed on her hiring application, women who'd worked with her at Mercy General in Seattle 15 years ago. He was methodical. Polite. Dangerous. "Hello, this is Dr. Robert Sterling, Chief of Cardiac Services at Sacred Heart Hospital in Norfolk. I'm conducting a routine credentialing verification." He paused for effect. "Can you confirm that a Margaret Walsh worked under your supervision between 2008 and 2010? Another pause. "Then, I'm going to be direct with you. If you've had any contact with this individual, any employment history, any association whatsoever, I need you to tell me now. Because we may have a serious liability situation. A young patient was placed at risk. And if you provide false information to protect her, you become complicit." The reference on the other end, a woman named Patricia who'd once held Margaret's hand while she cried about losing her husband, suddenly remembered nothing. "I'm sorry, I don't recall that name. I've worked with so many people over the years." Sterling thanked her and hung up. 3 calls. 3 erasures. By noon, Margaret's entire professional history had been surgically removed. The state investigator arrived at 1:41 p.m. His name was Terence Webb, and he carried a leather folder and the kind of exhausted expression that came from reviewing hospital complaints for 13 years. Dr. Sterling met him in his office with coffee and a carefully constructed narrative. "I'm concerned we may have hired someone under false pretenses," Sterling began, sliding a file across his desk. "Her credentials check out on paper, but yesterday she performed a procedure, pericardiocentesis for cardiac tamponade, with no physician present and no proper authorization." Webb flipped through the papers, his eyes sharp. "Who else was present?" "Just the patient. And a rotating army medic named Vasquez." Sterling leaned back in his chair, perfectly composed. That medic could corroborate. "Of course, he left this morning. Transferred to Walter Reed." It was a lie, but Webb wouldn't know until he tried to track Vasquez down, and by then it would be too late. Margaret didn't know any of this yet. She was in the ICU at 3:15 p.m., holding Michael Hartley's hand, checking his O2 saturation, making sure the young Marine's chest rose and fell with steady rhythm. His eyes were closed. His father, the general, sat in a chair beside the bed, watching her with an expression Margaret couldn't read. She worked in silence. She always worked in silence. At 3:22 p.m., security appeared at her locker. No explanation. No ceremony. Just a man in a uniform with a plastic badge and instructions. "You need to come with me, Ms. Walsh." Margaret's hand stilled. She was holding a coffee mug, a chipped ceramic thing her son had made in 6th grade, decorated with poorly drawn hearts. She set it down slowly. "What's this about?" "You'll need to ask administration." The walk to her locker took for minutes. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in a coffin. When they arrived, Margaret's locker was already empty. Someone had cleaned it out for her, removed the spare scrubs, the compression socks, the thermos, the photos. All of it was gone. There was only a cardboard box sitting on the bench in front of her open locker door. "Your things are in the box," the security officer said. "You'll need to pack anything personal and then surrender your badge." Margaret stared at the empty locker. Then she looked at the box. Inside were her mug and a fleece jacket, the one with the faded unit patch sewn carefully inside the lining, the patch she'd stitched in with surgical precision 18 years ago, the only physical proof that the life she'd lived before Norfolk had ever actually existed. She reached for the box. Her hands were steady. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She simply picked it up and turned toward the main security desk. The procession was quiet enough to hear the ambient hum of the building, the ventilation system, the distant beeping of monitors on other floors, the soft whisper of shoes on waxed tile. Day shift staff watched from behind their workstations. Nobody spoke. It was the kind of silence that made witnesses feel complicit, the kind that happened in hospitals when someone was being erased. Dr. Sterling stood in the administrative gallery on the second floor, looking down at the main security desk through the plexi wall that separated management from the floor. His arms were crossed. His expression was satisfied. Margaret could feel his gaze as she approached the desk, could feel the weight of his attention like pressure on her ribs. The security officer reached into a small drawer and removed her ID badge, the laminated card with her photo, the one that granted her access to the medicine rooms and the ICU and every protected space in the building. He held it between both hands and bent it. Once. Twice. The third bend snapped it clean in half. The sound was sharp. Definitive. The kind of break that couldn't be repaired. Margaret walked out of Sacred Heart Hospital at 12 p.m. carrying a cardboard box. The October rain had started sometime during her shift, soft rain, the kind that accumulates without violence, the kind that just sits on skin and clothes and gradually soaks through. She didn't rush. She didn't look back. She placed the box in the back seat of her 2007 Honda Civic, slid behind the wheel, and gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2. The clock on the dashboard read for 13. Her shift would have ended at 7 p.m. She would have been helping with evening medications. Michael would have been sleeping. The general would have been reading news on his phone. Margaret sat motionless for 7 minutes. Then she started the engine. She didn't drive home. Home was an apartment on Colley Avenue with her son's childhood drawings on the refrigerator and a coffee maker that broke 6 months ago and she never bothered replacing. Home was a place where she'd spent 15 years trying not to be the woman the Navy had killed. Instead, she drove to the Norfolk Veterans Affairs Hospital on Brambleton Avenue. 15 minutes. The parking lot was painted with handicap spots and faded lines. The waiting room smelled like old coffee and plastic furniture and the particular staleness of a public institution that never quite recovered from the previous day. She sat in an orange chair between a man with a prosthetic leg and an older veteran whose hands trembled with what looked like Parkinson's. Neither acknowledged her. She'd been invisible for so long that invisibility had become reflex. She could sit in a waiting room full of men she'd once saved and none of them would recognize the quiet woman in the discount scrubs who was slowly disappearing into the upholstery. A young Marine with a prosthetic left leg glanced over at her. His eyes were kind. "You okay?" he asked. His voice was gentle, the kind of gentle that came from knowing what broken looked like. Margaret nodded. She couldn't speak. Her throat had closed around words she didn't have clearance to say. She'd held this young man's brother's hand in a field hospital in Marjah while he bled through 3 units of blood. She'd watched his buddy, a sergeant named Chen, die on the surgical tent floor because the morphine ran out and there was nothing left to do but bear witness. She'd done things in the dark that the Navy had made her swear never to speak about. And now she was sitting in a waiting room, jobless and erased, while the men she'd bled for didn't even know her name. Her phone buzzed at 5:34 p.m. Daniel. Her son. Her 17-year-old, who was supposed to be in calculus right now, but wasn't. Mom, where are you? I went to the hospital. They said you were fired. Mom, what happened? Margaret's fingers shook as she typed, "Stay home. I'm handling it." The response came back in 9 seconds, "I'm coming to you." She texted him her location. He would come anyway if she told him not to. She'd raised him to question authority, to trust his instincts, to believe that doing the right thing mattered more than following the rules. She'd raised him to be his mother's son. And now that was going to break open everything she'd spent 15 years trying to bury. Margaret sat in the Norfolk VA waiting room and held the cardboard box on her lap and waited for her son to arrive with whatever was inside the attic that would change everything. The parking lot of Sacred Heart Hospital stretched out under the Virginia sun like a scar that wouldn't heal. Margaret sat in the driver's seat of her 10-year-old Honda Civic, hands gripping the steering wheel at 2 and 10 o'clock, the same grip she'd learned in a field hospital outside Fallujah, where letting go meant losing control of the bleeding. The cardboard box sat on the passenger seat, sealed with tape that looked older than her resolve. She hadn't opened it. Couldn't open it. Not yet. That was when Daniel ran across the asphalt like a Marine on his way to a bird. Her 17-year-old son was moving with a kind of desperate velocity that made his lungs work hard and his voice come out sharp. "Mom, they need to see these, you can't let him win." He was holding a shadow box against his ribs like it was ordnance. The glass front caught the sun and threw light back at her like a warning flare. Margaret knew what was inside before she looked. The Navy Cross. The Bronze Star with Valor. The Purple Hearts, 2 of them, arranged like a final argument in a courtroom where no one was listening. She got out of the car. The parking lot air smelled like hot asphalt and diesel from the ambulance bays. Sound, her footsteps on the pavement, his breathing, the distant beep of a truck backing up. She didn't ask questions. She followed her son back into the building that had just finished destroying her. The general's room was a gathering place now. 12 staff members stood in the space like they'd been waiting for permission to believe something. Dr. Chen, the head OR nurse, the one nurse who'd left her chair in the break room last of anyone, stood nearest the bed. General Hartley sat in the vinyl chair beside his son's wheelchair, his uniform crisp enough to cut paper. Michael was awake. His eyes tracked when Daniel entered. That was new. That was everything. Daniel stepped forward and his voice cracked like a radio transmission breaking through static. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. United States Navy. She spent 18 years keeping people alive in places that weren't supposed to have hospitals at all." The room's air pressure changed. Margaret felt it before she saw the reactions. It was the kind of silence that happens when a room realizes it has been standing next to something it couldn't see. Dr. Chen picked up the shadow box with hands that trembled like they were holding something sacred instead of just medals. She read aloud, and her voice was barely steady. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in action. Bronze Star with Valor for acts of bravery. Purple Heart. Purple Heart. She paused between each medal like she was translating an ancient language. These are real. These are combat decorations. The door to the room had been left open. A man stood in the hallway, grey at the temples, face weathered like a stone that had spent years in salt water. A scar cut through his left eyebrow like someone had tried to write a story there and given up. He stepped inside without asking permission. His presence moved through the room like a pressure system, and every person in it adjusted their breathing to accommodate it. "Kowalski," he said. "SEAL Team 3. I was visiting my brother down the hall." He looked at the medals. Then he looked at Margaret. His eyes held the recognition of someone who'd seen the same fire. "I know that Navy Cross. Helmand Province. Sanjin Valley." 2009, she was running forward while everyone else was running back. He turned to address the entire room, but his eyes stayed locked on Margaret. 7-hour firefight. Compound breach. She held a surgical site together for 9 hours, people, while mortar rounds shook the tent. One of the Marines in that tent was my team leader. He's got kids now because of her. 2 daughters. They go to Georgetown. The general stood from his chair. The movement was slow and deliberate, the way commanders move when they've made a decision that outranks everything else. The hospital administrator appeared in the doorway at the exact moment the general rose, as if the universe was timing things now. Dr. Hayes, the administrator, was holding papers that looked important enough to change things. The FBI has requested your personnel file, Margaret, Dr. Hayes said. His voice was careful and measured, the voice of someone who'd just realized they'd almost made a catastrophic mistake. In connection with the declassification of the Helmand Province operation. Your discharge papers are classified. Your service record is sealed. What you did in that hospital tent was classified until this morning. Dr. Sterling tried to leave. Margaret watched his hands move toward the door. She'd seen that movement before, the micro-adjustments of someone realizing they'd miscalculated the depth of the water they were standing in. His face was draining of color like someone was pulling a plug. The competent doctor who'd assembled 12 specialists and convinced a grieving father to give up had evaporated. What remained was a man in an expensive suit realizing his power had been measured in the dark, and the lights were coming on. The IT director stepped in from the hallway, Ramos, Marine Corps tattoo visible on his wrist, the kind of tattoo you got after deployment when you needed to mark yourself to prove you'd survived. He held up a USB drive the way archaeologists hold artifacts. Dr. Sterling attempted to access the security deletion protocol on the hospital server last night, Ramos said. His voice was the voice of someone who'd spent years managing systems and understood that every digital footprint was a confession. I saved every frame. Access logs show he attempted to erase recordings of his interactions with Margaret Walsh, including the incident in the break room, including the public write-up on the unit board. The timestamps match. Sterling's hands were shaking now. That's absurd. I was reviewing files for the... You accessed a protocol you have no authorization for, Ramos interrupted. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I've reported it to the board and the state medical licensing authority. They're reviewing the deletion attempt as we speak. The administrator turned to Sterling the way someone turns to look at something that's no longer where it's supposed to be. You brought in a state investigator based on fraudulent claims. You contacted references you knew were classified military numbers. You activated board members to pressure termination without due process. You ordered her escorted from the building while attempting to delete evidence of your own conduct. Dr. Chen found her voice. It was small and sharp at the same time. You called her a bedpan nurse. You humiliated her in front of a patient's family. You wrote her up on a public board for suggesting a treatment protocol that saved a Marine's life. Another nurse, Martinez, who'd stopped sitting at Margaret's table in the break room, added her words to the gathering evidence. You made us afraid to sit with her. You made us choose between being professional and being employed. The general's wife stood up from where she'd been sitting in the corner, the woman who'd watched her son wheel into this hospital with a hollow place where his future used to be. Her voice had ice underneath it that could freeze systems. You told me my son had no hope. You assembled 12 doctors to convince me to withdraw care. But she saw something you didn't. General Hartley looked at Margaret. His eyes held the weight of command and something else, recognition. The protocol you suggested. The one we didn't let her try. Would it have worked? Margaret met his gaze. She didn't look away. She never looked away from Marines. It worked on 7 blast victims I treated in Marjah. Same injury pattern. Same neural trauma. 6 of them regained motor function within 9 months. All 7 survived. She paused. 1 beat. Your son is the 8th. Sterling tried again. General, she's not credentialed. She violated every protocol in the system. She saved my son's life. The general cut him off. His voice was command voice, the kind that moves mountains because they've learned not to stay in its way. Twice. Once with her hands. Once by refusing to give up when you told us there was no hope. He looked at his son. Michael's eyes were tracking the room now. His lips moved like he was trying to form words. She did that. You didn't. The administrator addressed Sterling with the tone of someone reading a judgment that's already been written. You're suspended pending investigation. Security will escort you out. Sterling's hands moved to his hospital badge like someone removing shackles. He unclipped it with fingers that weren't steady. The badge clattered on the tile floor, a sound sharp enough to cut through the room like a gunshot in a quiet hallway. He reached down to pick it up and Kowalski stepped slightly to the side, not blocking but not moving out of the way either. The message was clear without words. Some men had to walk through other men to leave. Sterling stood up with his badge in his hand and his career in pieces and moved toward the door. Kowalski's voice caught him at the threshold. True class is what you do when the lights go out. You should think about that. Sterling didn't answer. He left the room and disappeared down the corridor like something the hospital was ejecting from its system. The silence that followed had weight. Margaret stood in that weight and let it settle around her like something that had finally been given permission to rest. 6 months later, the Pentagon courtyard was full of morning light. Corporal Michael Hartley stood in dress blues that fit him now in ways they hadn't fit before. His shoulders had broadened. His arms had muscle memory returning. The forearm crutches he held were titanium and carbon fiber, precision engineering for precision recovery. General Hartley stood beside him in full uniform, medals arranged on his chest like a biography in metal. Margaret stood on Michael's other side wearing her dress whites for the first time in 15 years. The Navy Cross gleamed at her throat. The Bronze Star with Valor sat below it. The Purple Hearts were there too, proof that staying alive in war meant carrying scars in places most people couldn't see. Michael took a breath. The cameras waited. The photographers sensed something about to happen, that moment when a body does what it hasn't done, when the brain fires a signal down a neural pathway that was supposed to stay dark and the legs respond. He handed his crutches to his mother. 5 steps. His gait was uneven but his determination was straight as a laser. His father waited at the end of those 5 steps with his hand raised in a salute that held everything, gratitude and recognition and the acknowledgement of a battle fought in a hospital instead of a war zone. General Hartley held that salute until Margaret returned it, her hand rising with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime honoring the people who'd refused to break. You didn't just save my son, the general said. His voice carried across the courtyard like an official record. You gave him his future back, Senior Chief. Margaret's eyes were wet but her voice was steady. Composure under pressure. That's what they were standing around. That's what had always been standing around. I've never given up on a Marine, sir. Wasn't about to start. The ceremony concluded with photographs and handshakes and the quiet satisfaction of seeing something broken get welded back into place by hands that refused to stop working. Later, Daniel showed his mother a news article on his phone. The Virginia Tech News section had picked it up. Dr. Sterling, after losing his medical license, now taught CPR certification classes at Tidewater Community College. $14 an hour. Margaret read the article without expression. The phones and the monitors and the cardboard boxes full of medals, it all just moved past like traffic she didn't have to acknowledge anymore. She handed the phone back to her son. How does that make you feel? Daniel asked. That question. The one that assumes feelings matter when competence is the only currency that matters. Margaret looked across the courtyard at Michael laughing with his mother, his legs steady underneath him, his future no longer a question mark. She thought about the break room table. The nurses who'd stopped sitting with her. The way competence goes invisible until the moment it becomes impossible to ignore. I feel like I did my job, Margaret said. That's all I've ever wanted to do. That evening, she walked back through Sacred Heart Hospital. Not as an LPN. Not as the invisible bedpan nurse. The VA hospital system had created a new position, Director of Combat Trauma Integration. Margaret Walsh held that title now. She walked through the ICU where nurses greeted her by rank. She moved through corridors she'd walked for 3 years as someone everyone looked through, and now they parted like she was moving through water. She touched the faded unit patch, still sewn inside her jacket lining, and let herself remember Marjah and Sanjin and the 7 Marines who'd walked out of hospitals because someone refused to accept the word never. In the break room where everyone had left when she sat down, she made coffee. The same coffee machine. The same break room table. She sat down and the sound of chairs scraping was different now. It was the sound of people choosing to move toward her instead of away. Dr. Chen sat down first. Her eyes held something different than they'd held 6 months ago. Respect. Recognition. The acknowledgement of power that had always been there, just waiting to be seen. "Teach us," Chen said. Margaret nodded. She looked around the table at the nurses who'd been afraid to sit with her, who'd let isolation become their default, who'd learned to doubt what their instincts were telling them about a woman who knew more about saving lives than anyone they'd been trained to follow. "True class is what you do when the lights go out," Margaret said. "Let's make sure you're ready for the ones that matter." The break room filled with the sound of nurses pulling up chairs. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Rain started against the windows outside. And in that room, surrounded by people who were finally ready to learn from the person who'd refused to give up, Margaret Walsh poured coffee and began teaching what 15 years of war had taught her, that the quietest people in the room are often the ones holding everything together, and the ones who've seen the worst are the ones you want standing beside you when darkness comes. If you've made it this far, you know the truth. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes they push mops. Sometimes they save lives in the dark. Sometimes they wear scrubs and refuse to give up on someone else's son because they understand that courage isn't about titles or medals, it's about showing up when everyone else has already decided the battle is lost. If Margaret's story hit you, if you found yourself thinking about the quiet warriors in your own life, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to know that true class isn't about what you do when the cameras are watching. It's about what you do when the lights go out and only you and your conscience are left in the dark. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know what you were capable of? Tell us your story.